In 1988, Ames Department Stores made the biggest purchase in its history, and it should have made them a giant, not Sears, not Kmart. Ames, a chain that started in an abandoned textile mill in Massachusetts, run by two brothers who believed small towns deserved a discount store of their own. For 30 years, Ames had grown by finding the towns everyone else ignored, the rural crossroads, the fading mill towns, the places too small for Sears, too far from the interstate for the big chains to bother with. Families lay-awayed Christmas gifts there. Kids bought their first bikes there. Then in one $800 million deal, Ames swallowed 392 Zayre stores overnight, doubling its size, becoming the fourth largest discount retailer in America. 14 years later, every single Ames store was dark. How does the deal that was supposed to make a company invincible become the deal that kills it? This is the story of the chain that tried to save small-town America and disappeared trying. Milton Gilman was 31 years old in 1958, and he had spent most of that decade watching how people in small New England towns actually shopped. His younger brother Irving was right there with him. Together, the two brothers had grown up in a family already familiar with the discount retail business, and they had a theory that most of the big retailers in America were getting wrong. The working families in small mill towns and rural crossroads didn't need fancy displays or downtown department store prestige. They needed low prices, in-stock shelves, and somewhere close enough to drive to on a Saturday. Southbridge, Massachusetts gave them their chance. The town had been a center of the optical and textile industries for generations, and sitting empty in the middle of it was an old mill building that had once belonged to the Ames Worsted Textile Company. Rows of brick, tall windows, the kind of industrial skeleton that most people drove past without a second look. Milton and Irving saw something else: cheap square footage, a ready-made building in a town full of working people who needed somewhere to spend their paychecks without driving 45 minutes to Worcester or Springfield. They opened their store in that mill in 1958, and when it came time to name it, they didn't invent something new. They kept the name already stitched into the town's memory: Ames, because the building had worn it for decades and everyone in Southbridge already knew it. It was a practical choice as much as a sentimental one, and it set a pattern that would define the company for the next 30 years. Take what already existed, make it useful again. Sell it to people the big chains overlooked. Inside, the first Ames store was not glamorous. Concrete floors, plain steel shelving, merchandise stacked high because the whole point was volume. Clothing, housewares, tools, the basic goods a family actually needed rather than the aspirational goods a department store liked to sell. There was no elegant lighting, no perfume counter, no doorman. The customers who walked through that first year were mill workers, tradesmen, mothers stretching a weekly budget across 5 or 6 kids. The exact people Sears and Fellini's in the city center rarely built a store to serve. What made it different wasn't the merchandise. It was who the merchandise was for. Milton Gilman's belief, the one he carried into every expansion decision for decades afterward, was simple. The small towns of New England were not a lesser market to be served last. They were a market nobody else had bothered to take seriously, and whoever got there first, with fair prices and no pretension, would own it. He was right, and for 30 years that quiet conviction was enough. But conviction that builds a company slowly is not always the same conviction that survives when a company decides to grow fast. And that is where the story turns next. By the late 1970s, the store in the old Southbridge Mill had become something much bigger, and it had gotten there the same way it started, by picking up what other people had left behind. In January 1972, 14 years after opening, Ames made its first real acquisitions, absorbing the Joseph Levitt Corporation and the K&R Warehouse Corporation. 6 years later, it bought the Davis Wholesale Company, which brought 13 former W.T. Grant stores into the fold. Grant's had just collapsed, one of the largest retail bankruptcies in American history at the time, and Ames walked into the wreckage and took what it could use. 10 months after that, Ames purchased Neisner Brothers, a chain of 32 stores across New York and Florida that was sitting in its own Chapter 11 reorganization. Then in 1984 came King's Department Stores, another Massachusetts chain that had gone under after a failed acquisition of its own. A year later, Ames added stores from G.C. Murphy. None of this looked like empire building from the outside. It looked like patience. Every acquisition followed the same quiet formula. Find a chain that had failed, often in towns just like the ones Ames already served, and turn the lights back on under a new sign. By the mid-1980s, Ames had grown into one of the largest discount retailers in the country, with hundreds of stores spread across rural communities, small cities, and the edges of suburban sprawl throughout the Northeast, the Mid-Atlantic, and parts of the Midwest. For the families who shopped there, none of that history mattered as much as what happened every November. The Ames Christmas season followed a rhythm that repeated itself in town after town, year after year. The toy aisles filled first, stacked floor to ceiling weeks before Thanksgiving, and parents began doing what generations of working families before them had done at stores just like it. They walked up to the layaway counter, picked out what their kids would find under the tree, and put down a few dollars a week until the balance was paid off by December. For families stretching a factory paycheck or a farm income across a year, layaway wasn't a convenience. It was the only way Christmas happened at all. A mother could walk into Ames in October, choose a bicycle or a doll, or a train set before it sold out, and know that no matter how tight money got in the weeks that followed, that gift was already hers. Nobody would sell it out from under her. That was the emotional core of what Ames sold, in every season, not just the holidays. It wasn't glamour, it was reliability, in towns where reliability was harder to come by than people in the cities ever understood. In a mill town where the plant had just laid off a shift, or a farming community waiting on a harvest, Ames was the store that didn't require a special trip to the city and didn't make anyone feel poor for shopping carefully. Employees who worked the floor during these years often described the same thing. Regulars who came in every single week, cashiers who knew customers' names and their kids' shoe sizes, a level of familiarity that a store the size of Sears in a downtown flagship location could never really replicate in a small town of 4,000 or 5,000 people. And Ames kept finding those towns. While the big chains were fighting each other in the major metro markets, Ames built its identity around the places retail history tends to forget: the crossroads towns, the old mill villages, the small cities too modest for a Sears but too proud to go without a store of their own. It became, in dozens of communities across New England and the Mid-Atlantic, the only real discount department store many families had ever known. Grandparents shopped there, then their children did, then their grandchildren. By 1987, the company was approaching 400 stores, still profitable, still expanding the same patient way it always had, buying what others had let fail and making it useful again. What nobody in those stores could have known, standing at the layaway counter with a bicycle set aside for December, was that the very habit that had built Ames, buying up other people's failures, was about to produce the single biggest gamble of the company's history. Somewhere in a boardroom, executives were looking at one more struggling chain, one far larger than anything Ames had ever swallowed before, and deciding it was worth the risk. The decision came together in boardrooms in 1988, and on paper it looked like the deal of a lifetime. Zayre Corporation, a much larger discount chain with 392 stores concentrated in the Northeast, Illinois, and Florida, was struggling under the same competitive pressure, squeezing every mid-size retailer in America. Walmart expanding relentlessly out of the South. Kmart pushing into every region. Big box formats eating away at anyone without the scale to compete on price. Zayre's parent company decided to get out of the discount store business entirely, sell the chain, and reorganize its remaining assets into what would eventually become the TJX companies. Ames is still run with the same acquisitive instinct that had built it for 30 years, stepped in and paid roughly $800 million for the entire Zayre operation. It was by a wide margin the largest purchase in the company's history, nearly triple the number of stores Ames operated before the deal closed. Overnight, the small-town discount chain that had grown one careful acquisition at a time became the fourth largest discount retailer in the United States, with close to 700 stores stretched across 20 states. But this acquisition was not like the others. King's, Neesner's, the old W.T. Grant locations, those had been modest, digestible, close enough to Ames's existing footprint that folding them in was mostly a matter of changing the signage. Zayre was different in scale and different in shape. Its stores were clustered in three regions that had almost nothing to do with each other operationally. The Northeast, where Ames already had deep roots, but also Illinois and Florida, markets Ames had never seriously operated in before. Converting hundreds of Zayre stores into Ames stores meant retraining staff, rebuilding supply chains, renegotiating leases, and doing it all at a pace the company had never attempted. The financial mechanics of the deal only added to the strain. Ames borrowed heavily to fund the purchase, and then spent even more converting the stores it had just acquired. New signage, new inventory systems, new store layouts to match the Ames format. Somewhere in that same period, the company's traditional red and white color scheme began to disappear from stores across the Northeast, replaced by the green that Zayre locations had always worn. It was a small, almost accidental detail, but it captured something true about the merger. Ames had bought Zayre, but in some ways, Zayre was reshaping Ames right back. To help pay for all of it and to keep new customers spending in a chain that had just doubled overnight, Ames leaned hard into consumer credit. The company extended credit cards broadly, often without the kind of careful screening a more cautious lender would have insisted on, hoping to lock in loyalty and market share the same way its retail footprint had just expanded. It was a strategy built for growth, not for resilience, a bet that spending would keep climbing fast enough to outrun the debt piling up underneath it. For the employees inside this newly doubled company, 1988 and 1989 were a blur of change. Longtime Ames workers in New England found themselves suddenly part of an operation with stores in Florida and Illinois they'd never see and couldn't quite picture. Former Zayre employees, meanwhile, were learning a new company culture, a new logo, new procedures, often in stores that hadn't even finished being physically converted. Morale in those years was less about excitement over becoming a national player and more about uncertainty, a sense that the company was moving faster than its own systems could keep up with. And yet on the surface, none of this looked like trouble. It looked like triumph. Ames was bigger than it had ever been, in more states than it had ever touched, closing in on a scale that put it in the same conversation as the discount retail giants it had spent 30 years quietly avoiding. The company was about to reach the highest point it would ever occupy in American retail. And almost nobody inside it yet understood how thin the ground beneath that height had already become. By 1989, Ames stood at the highest point it would ever reach. Nearly 700 stores, 20 states, stretching from the small mill towns of New England down through the mid-Atlantic and out into pockets of the Midwest. Fourth largest discount retailer in the United States. A company that had started in a converted textile mill, now standing in the same conversation as chains with household names in every major city in the country. For a business built on finding the towns everyone else ignored, this was the moment it could no longer be ignored by anyone. The slogan on the signs and in the newspaper circulars captured exactly what the company wanted to be known for. Bargains by the bagful. It wasn't sophisticated. It wasn't trying to be. It was a direct promise to the exact customer Ames had always served. Come in, fill a bag, spend less than you would anywhere else, and don't apologize for shopping carefully. That promise, repeated across hundreds of towns for 3 decades, had become something close to a civic fact of life in the communities where Ames operated. In places too small for Sears and too far from a mall for Kmart to bother building one. Ames wasn't just a store. It was often the store, the only real discount retailer many families in a given county had ever known. That reach showed up most clearly every November when Ames stores across the Northeast transformed for the holiday season in a way regular customers came to count on year after year. Toy departments expanded to take over entire sections of the floor. Layaway lines formed at the customer service counter, sometimes stretching back toward the registers, filled with parents who had already picked out what their children would unwrap on Christmas morning and were now paying it down $5 and $10 at a time. For families in mill towns where a factory shift had just been cut, or farming communities waiting on a check that hadn't cleared yet, that layaway line represented something no advertisement could manufacture. Certainty. The gift was already chosen. It was already theirs. All that was left was the waiting. This was generational in a way few retailers ever managed to become. Grandparents who had shopped the very first Ames stores in the 1960s brought their grown children back to buy school clothes in the 1970s and 1980s, and those children, now parents themselves, brought their own kids through the same doors for Christmas layaway in the years just before the Zayre acquisition. Employees who worked the floor through this era remember customers by name across decades, not because Ames trained them to, but because in a town of 4,000 or 5,000 people, everybody eventually recognized everybody, and the woman ringing up your groceries in 1975 might still be there. Older now, ringing up your children's school shoes in 1988. That familiarity extended beyond the cash register. In dozens of small communities, Ames stores anchored the same strip of highway or town center for so long that they became fixtures of local life in ways that had nothing to do with retail. They were where a chamber of commerce might post a notice, where a Little League team sold raffle tickets by the entrance on a Saturday morning, where a struggling town's remaining commercial district still had at least one reliable employer keeping the lights on after the mills themselves had gone quiet. In towns that had already lost their factories, their downtowns, sometimes their movie theaters, Ames often remained standing, still hiring, still open 7 days a week, long after other institutions in the same town had closed their doors for good. It would be easy, looking back from what came later, to rush past this moment, to treat 1989 as nothing more than the calm before the storm. But that would miss what actually mattered to the people who lived through it. For millions of families across the Northeast, this was not a company teetering on the edge of anything. This was simply where they shopped, where they were known, where a promise made in October about a Christmas gift was still being kept in December, the same as it always had been. What none of them could see, what almost no one outside a handful of executive offices could see, was that the very deal responsible for this scale, the Zayre acquisition that had made Ames a national name almost overnight, had already begun quietly working against everything that made the company work in the first place. The trouble did not announce itself all at once. It surfaced the way most corporate crises do, quietly, in places most customers would never think to look, long before it reached the sales floor. The first problem was geography. The Zayre stores Ames had just spent $800 million acquiring were not conveniently clustered near its existing Northeast base. They sat in 3 separate regions that had almost nothing in common operationally. The familiar Northeast corridor, yes, but also Illinois and Florida, markets where Ames had no distribution infrastructure, no established supplier relationships, and no institutional memory of how to run a store. Coordinating inventory, staffing, and logistics across 3 disconnected regions turned out to be far harder and far more expensive than anyone in the boardroom had modeled when the deal was signed. Trucks ran inefficient routes. Warehouses meant for a smaller, more concentrated company strained to serve stores 1,000 miles apart. What looked like simple arithmetic on an acquisition spreadsheet, 392 more stores, roughly triple the footprint, turned out to be a completely different, far messier business to actually operate. The second problem was the conversion itself. Turning a Zayre into an Ames was not as simple as changing a sign out front. Every store needed new inventory systems, new employee training, new layouts to match Ames's format, and the cost of doing all of that, store by store, across hundreds of locations, piled up far faster than the revenue coming in to offset it. Ames had budgeted for growth. It had not fully budgeted for the sheer expense of digesting a company nearly its own size in less than 2 years. The third problem was the one almost nobody outside the company understood until much later, and it was arguably the most dangerous: credit. In the rush to hold on to new customers and keep the newly doubled company's cash flow moving, Ames had extended consumer credit aggressively, often approving cards for shoppers without carefully checking their credit histories. It was a strategy built on a simple bet that easy credit would keep people spending, and spending would keep the company solvent while it absorbed Zayre. For a while, it worked exactly as intended, but easy credit extended without real underwriting has a way of catching up to a lender eventually. And by late 1989, delinquencies and bad debt were quietly eating into margins that were already thin from the cost of conversion. None of this was visible from inside an Ames store in the fall of 1989. A mother in a small Pennsylvania town putting a bicycle on layaway that November had no reason to suspect anything was wrong. The shelves were stocked. The layaway counter was open. The cashier still knew her name. That is the particular cruelty of a corporate crisis built on debt and logistics rather than empty shelves. It is invisible to the very people who will eventually lose the most when it finally breaks into the open. Inside the company, the picture looked very different. Executives were watching profitability slide through late 1989 and into early 1990, and the warning signs that had seemed manageable a year earlier were compounding faster than the recovery plans meant to address them. Suppliers were beginning to grow cautious. Some vendors, watching Ames's payment patterns slow, started tightening terms or delaying new shipments. The kind of quiet, unglamorous signal that rarely makes the newspaper but tells everyone inside a retail company exactly how serious the situation has become. A store cannot sell what it cannot stock, and a company that manufacturers no longer trust to pay on time is a company running out of room to maneuver. By the spring of 1990, less than 2 years after the Zayre deal had made Ames the fourth largest discount chain in the country, the company was no longer managing an ambitious expansion. It was managing a crisis, and the very growth that had seemed in 1988 like the reward for 30 years of patient, careful acquisitions was about to reveal itself as something else entirely, a debt the company could not outrun. How does a company built for 30 years on caution end up nearly destroyed by the single boldest decision it ever made? By April 1990, the numbers inside Ames Department Stores had stopped being a warning and become a wall. Manufacturers who had shipped merchandise to Ames for years were now refusing to send new inventory without payment up front. Bankers who had financed 30 years of careful, methodical acquisitions were refusing to extend the company another dollar of credit. The debt taken on to buy Zayre, combined with the runaway cost of converting hundreds of stores and the bad consumer credit quietly eating into cash flow, had finally caught up with a company that 18 months earlier had been celebrated as the fourth largest discount retailer in America. On April 25, 1990, Ames filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. The decision that put the company there had been made 2 years earlier in a boardroom by executives who believed the Zayre acquisition was the opportunity of a generation, a chance to leap from regional player to national name in a single move. At the time, it must have felt less like a gamble than a formality. Ames had been buying failed and struggling chains for 30 years, always successfully, always turning someone else's collapse into its own growth. Zayre looked, on paper, like simply the biggest version of a strategy that had never failed before. What the decision-makers underestimated was scale itself. The difference between absorbing a chain of 30 stores and absorbing one of nearly 400, spread across regions Ames had never operated in, financed with debt the company had never carried before. Shortly after the bankruptcy filing, Ames's chairman resigned. In his place came Stephen Pistner, a specialist brought in specifically because he had a reputation for walking into distressed retailers and pulling them back from the edge. Pistner's job was not glamorous. It meant closing stores. 370 of them during the bankruptcy proceedings, most in rural pockets of the Northeast, the very kind of small-town locations that had once defined everything Ames stood for. It meant renegotiating with creditors, restructuring debt, and making the case to suppliers and lenders that the company that had just made the worst financial decision in its history could still be trusted to run a business. It also meant confronting an uncomfortable question that Ames itself eventually asked out loud, in the most direct way a company can ask it, through a lawsuit. During the bankruptcy proceedings, Ames sued the investment banking firm that had advised it to buy Zayre in the first place, alleging that the advice had been built on inaccurate and misleading information, delivered by advisors with their own financial interest in seeing the deal close. It was, in effect, the company publicly arguing that it had been steered into disaster by the very professionals paid to protect it from one. The case would not settle until 1994 for $19 million, a small fraction of the losses the Zayre deal had caused. But a formal acknowledgement, years later, that something in the process behind that decision had gone seriously wrong. For the people working inside Ames stores during these years, none of this boardroom drama translated into headlines. It translated into something much more immediate: uncertainty about whether the store they worked at would still exist next season. Employees who had spent years building relationships with regular customers, who knew which families relied on layaway, who could greet a longtime shopper by name, now found themselves working inside a company whose future was being decided in bankruptcy court, often with little more information than what leaked out through regional newspapers or word of mouth from other locations. Former Zayre employees, many of whom had only just finished adjusting to becoming Ames employees, absorbed a particularly disorienting version of this instability. They had changed uniforms, changed procedures, changed the very identity of the store they walked into every morning. And within 2 years, some of those same stores were being shuttered as part of the very restructuring their conversion had been meant to prevent. In town after town across the Northeast, the pattern repeated. A store that had been Zayre, then briefly Ames, then simply gone. Its space sitting empty on a strip of highway that had already lost a factory or a downtown movie theater in the years before. The moment insiders inside Ames truly understood the severity of what had happened is difficult to pin to a single day, but the financial reality was unambiguous by early 1990. A company that manufacturers no longer trusted to pay its bills and that bankers no longer trusted to repay its loans had run out of paths forward that did not involve bankruptcy court. The Zayre deal, celebrated in 1988 as validation of 30 years of disciplined growth, had in less than 2 years become the very thing threatening to end the company that made it. And yet, this is not where the story ends. Ames did not disappear in 1990. Pissner's restructuring worked, at least for a time. The company would close hundreds of stores, shed the weight of its worst decisions, and emerge from bankruptcy in December 1992, leaner and remarkably profitable again. It would even attempt one more act of the same acquisitive instinct that had built it in the first place, buying the Hills Stores chain in 1998 and growing once more. But a company that survives its first near-death experience does not automatically survive its second. And for Ames, the deeper question the Zayre disaster raised, whether the very strategy that had built the company for 30 years could ever truly be trusted again, was never fully answered. It was only postponed. Who exactly was supposed to protect a company and the tens of thousands of people who depended on it from a decision that even the company's own lawyers would later argue was built on bad advice? Ames emerged from bankruptcy on December 30, 1992, and for a company that had spent 2 years fighting for survival, the recovery that followed was genuinely remarkable. The green color scheme adopted from the old Zayre stores had, by now, become simply what Ames looked like. A small, almost symbolic sign of how completely the two companies had merged into one identity. Under Stephen Pissner's restructuring, and later under new leadership, the company returned to profitability in 1993 and kept climbing. By fiscal 1996, net income had reached $17.3 million, a sharp turnaround from a net loss the year before. For a chain that had been on the edge of liquidation just 4 years earlier, this was vindication. The formula that had built Ames in the first place, careful, opportunistic growth, seemed to be working again. So when the opportunity came in December 1998 to acquire the Hills Stores chain, it must have felt less like a risk and more like a return to form. The deal brought 155 Hills department stores into the Ames family, along with 10 former Caldor locations, expanding the company's footprint by roughly 50% in a single move. Caldor and Hills were both fellow Northeast discounters that had struggled through their own bankruptcies in the 1990s, and Ames, the company that had always grown by absorbing other people's failures, was doing what it did best one more time. For a moment, it looked like Ames had learned from Zayre and found a way to grow safely after all. But the cracks in the Hills integration showed up faster this time, and the company moved to address them with a speed that Zayre had never allowed. In March 1999, Ames closed 8 stores in markets where its own locations and its newly acquired Hills stores overlapped, a sign that management had learned at least one lesson from 1988. Don't wait 2 years to admit a mismatch exists. In November 2000, the company closed 32 more stores, 31 of them former Hills locations, the weakest performers in a chain that had never fully recovered from its own troubles before Ames bought it. These were manageable adjustments, the kind any large retailer makes as it digests an acquisition. What nobody watching from inside an Ames store could have known was that they were also the first tremors of something much larger. The retail landscape of the early 2000s was nothing like the landscape Ames had been built for. Discount shopping was consolidating around a handful of enormous national players, Walmart and Target chief among them, with buying power and logistics networks that a regional chain built on small-town loyalty simply could not match. Ames had survived the 1990s by being patient and careful. The 2000s were rewarding scale and speed, and Ames, weighed down by debt it still carried from a decade of acquisitions, had neither. On August 20th, 2001, Ames closed 47 stores and filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection for the second time in 11 years. This time, there would be no Stephen Pissner arriving with a turnaround plan that worked. The closures that followed came in waves, each one smaller than the last. Each one another piece of the company quietly disappearing from towns that had depended on it for decades. In November 2001, 16 more stores closed, along with a distribution center. The kind of behind-the-scenes closure that rarely makes local news but tells anyone paying attention exactly how much capacity a company is shedding just to stay alive. In December 2001, 54 additional stores went dark, leaving the chain with roughly 333 locations, a fraction of what it had operated just 3 years earlier after the Hills acquisition. By June 2002, 6 more stores had closed. The company was down to 327. For employees, the pattern by now was sickeningly familiar. A store manager would receive word from corporate. A closing date would be posted. Inventory would be marked down in stages, 20%, then 40%, then more, until the shelves that had once been stocked for a family's Christmas layaway were bare, picked over, and finally empty. Longtime employees, some who had worked the same store for 15 or 20 years, packed up registers and fixtures they had used every day of their working lives. In small towns where an Ames store had been one of the last steady employers left after the mills and factories had already gone, the closing of the local Ames wasn't just the loss of a place to shop, it was the loss of one of the only paychecks still being written in town. Customers noticed too, even if most had no idea how close the whole company was to disappearing entirely. Regulars who had shopped there for years would walk in to find half-empty shelves, liquidation signs in the windows, employees who couldn't say for certain whether the store would still be open the following month. For a chain that had built its entire identity on being the reliable place, the store where the layaway gift was always safe, where the shelves were always stocked, the sight of its own stores hollowing out in real time was a quiet, devastating kind of ending, unfolding in slow motion over the better part of a year. Then on August 14th, 2002, Ames executives made the announcement that ended any remaining hope of another recovery. The company would close all 327 remaining stores and wind down the business entirely, converting its Chapter 11 reorganization into a Chapter 7 liquidation. In a statement explaining the decision, the company pointed to continued softness in sales combined with suppliers tightening terms and slowing shipments. Manufacturers, once again, no longer willing to extend the trust a retailer depends on to keep its shelves full. It was almost an exact echo of April 1990, the same warning signs that had nearly killed the company 12 years earlier, this time arriving with no path back. The liquidation sales that followed were the last version of Ames most of its longtime customers would ever see. Stores stripped of their normal order, fixtures and shelving sold alongside marked-down merchandise, the quiet urgency of a going-out-of-business sale, replacing the familiar rhythm of a Saturday morning shopping trip. By the time the last doors locked for good in the fall of 2002, roughly 22,000 people had lost their jobs, and 44 years after two brothers opened a discount store in an abandoned textile mill, the Ames name disappeared from the American retail landscape entirely. How does a company survive the near death of its worst decision, only to lose everything a decade later to the slow, quiet arithmetic of an industry that had simply moved on without it? When the last Ames doors locked in the fall of 2002, the buildings themselves did not stay empty for long. In town after town across the Northeast, The same pattern played out that had played out decades earlier, when Ames itself had moved into spaces left behind by Grants, Neisners, and Kings. Some locations were picked up by other regional retailers still hanging on. Others sat vacant for years, especially in the smaller, more rural markets Ames had always specialized in. The exact towns too modest to attract a Walmart or a Target. The very customer base that had once made Ames unique now left with no discount retailer at all. In some of those communities, the closing of the local Ames didn't just end a shopping option, it ended the last one. There was no meaningful revival attempt. Unlike some defunct chains whose names occasionally resurface as nostalgia pop-ups or licensing deals, the Ames name has largely stayed retired, a relic of a specific vanished model of discount retail rather than a brand anyone tried to resurrect. The company's assets were liquidated, its remaining leases sold off piece by piece, and the corporate structure that had once employed 22,000 people simply ceased to exist. The broader lesson Ames left behind is one the retail industry has revisited many times since in different forms. A company that grows for 30 years through careful, incremental acquisition can be undone by a single deal that changes its scale faster than its systems, its financing, or its culture can absorb. The Zayre acquisition was not a reckless idea in isolation. It followed the exact playbook that had built Ames from one Milltown store into one of the largest discount chains in the country. But playbooks that work at one scale do not automatically work at triple that scale, and the debt, the logistical strain, and the credit risk that came with swallowing Zayre proved that the difference between a good strategy and a fatal one is sometimes simply a matter of how much a company tries to do at once. Even the second bankruptcy, arriving a full decade after the company had proven it could recover, showed how much weight a retailer can carry forward from a wound that never fully healed. Debt taken on in 1988 that shaped every decision Ames made for the rest of its existence. The economic impact on the communities Ames served went largely undocumented by national media, which treated the closure mostly as a routine business story. A mid-sized retailer failing amid a wave of larger, more famous collapses in the years around it. But in the small towns Ames had spent decades cultivating, the loss was anything but routine. Long-time employees, many with 15 or 20 years at the same store, lost jobs that were not easily replaced in towns where good employers were already scarce. Workers who had built careers inside the Ames system, buyers, regional managers, longtime store staff, scattered into whatever retail jobs remained, some successfully rebuilding elsewhere, others finding that a lifetime of experience at one company translated less easily than they expected into a retail industry rapidly consolidating around a handful of national giants. What does it mean for a small town when the one store that always kept its doors open, the one employer that outlasted the factories, finally closes for good, and nothing quite like it ever comes to take its place? Somewhere in a small town in Massachusetts or Pennsylvania or upstate New York, there is a man in his 60s who still remembers standing at a layaway counter in November, watching a cashier write his name on a ticket taped to a bicycle he could not yet afford to take home. He remembers coming back every week that December, handing over a few dollars, watching the balance shrink, and finally, a few days before Christmas, wheeling that bicycle out to the car himself. He does not remember the name of the cashier. He does not remember exactly which year it was. But he remembers the bicycle, and he remembers the feeling of a promise being kept by people who had no reason to keep it, except that keeping promises was simply what the store did. That is what Ames was, underneath the acquisitions and the bankruptcies and the boardroom decisions that eventually ended it. It was the store in the town too small for anyone else to bother with. It was the discount chain that never asked its customers to feel embarrassed about counting their dollars carefully, because counting dollars carefully was the whole reason the store existed in the first place. Two brothers built it out of an abandoned textile mill because they understood something the bigger chains never fully grasped. That dignity in shopping had nothing to do with marble floors or downtown addresses, and everything to do with being seen, being known, and being trusted to keep your word about a bicycle you'd pay off $5 at a time. For 30 years, that trust was the entire business model. It showed up in the cashier who knew a family's shoe sizes without asking. It showed up in the layaway counter that never once, in 100 small towns, failed to hold a Christmas gift for a family that needed the extra weeks to pay for it. It showed up in a chain that grew not by chasing the biggest cities, but by walking into the wreckage of other people's failures. Grants, Nationers, Kings, and turning the lights back on for towns that had already lost enough. In an America that was steadily consolidating its retail landscape around a handful of national giants, Ames represented something increasingly rare, a company whose entire reason for existing was built around the customer the scale usually leaves behind. That is also, in the end, what makes its disappearance worth remembering. Beyond the numbers and the bankruptcy filings and the store counts that rose and fell across 4 decades. When Ames closed for good, it did not just remove a shopping option from a map. It removed one of the last remaining threads connecting some of these towns to the version of themselves that still had a factory, still had a downtown, still had somewhere steady to work and somewhere reliable to shop. The mills had already gone quiet in most of these places by the time Ames disappeared too. What Ames took with it, when it finally closed, was one of the last institutions still standing that remembered what those towns used to be. None of this erases the decisions that led to the end. The acquisition that grew too large too fast, the debt that never fully left the company's shoulders, the second collapse that arrived because an industry had changed faster than a mid-sized regional chain could follow. Those facts remain true, and they explain as clearly as anything can why a company that survived 30 years of careful growth could not survive 2 decades of aggressive consolidation around it. But facts about balance sheets were never what kept customers coming back to Ames for 44 years. What kept them coming back was simpler, and it is the part of the story worth holding on to now that the stores themselves are gone. Two brothers believed that a town too small for anyone else deserved a store of its own. For 4 decades, in hundreds of communities across the Northeast, that belief held. It held through recessions, through competitors rising and falling around it, through one near-fatal mistake the company somehow survived. It held every November at every layaway counter, for every family that walked out in December with exactly what they had promised their children they would have. The buildings are mostly gone now, or repurposed, or standing empty along a stretch of highway that has seen better decades. But somewhere, in the memory of the people who grew up walking through those doors, the promise Ames made, that dignity and Christmas and a decent price could all belong to the same small store, is still being kept.